The large hotel looked grand from the outside, filled with lights, laughter, and guests who came in expensive cars. Everyone saw it as a place of success and luxury, but behind the beautiful walls worked many people whose lives were very different from the guests they served. Among the staff was a man who no one paid much attention to. He wore the same uniform as the other workers, walked the same long hallways, and carried the same heavy load of duties. No one knew that he was, in truth, the owner and CEO of the company, living undercover to see what life was really like for his employees. For days, he worked quietly as part of the cleaning crew, polishing mirrors, moving luggage, and helping in the laundry room. He wanted to learn what his workers went through every single day. His managers only reported numbers and profits to him, but he had a feeling that real stories lived in the shadows of the hotel's shining floors. So he disguised himself, even using a fake name, and began working among them without revealing who he truly was. He noticed how hard the staff worked. From the doorman standing on tired feet for long hours to the kitchen helpers sweating by the hot stoves, each person gave their energy to keep the place running. But there was one woman who caught his eye more than others. Her name was Rosa. She was a maid in her late 30s, always moving quickly with her cleaning cart, her hands never still. She was polite and hard-working, never complaining, but her eyes often looked sad and distant, as if her thoughts were somewhere else. One evening, after a long shift, the CEO walked into the small staff lounge to rest for a moment. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of someone sobbing. He turned his head and saw Rosa sitting on a chair in the corner. She thought she was alone, so she didn't notice him at first. Her shoulders shook as she cried into her hands. On the table in front of her lay a folded piece of paper, stained with drops of water, her tears. Curious and concerned, he walked closer. When Rosa looked up, she quickly wiped her eyes and tried to smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But the CEO, still acting as a fellow worker, asked gently, "Are you okay? Do you want some water?" She hesitated, then nodded. He handed her a small paper cup and sat beside her, waiting quietly. Sometimes silence opens the door for someone to speak. Slowly, Rosa unfolded the paper on the table. It was a hospital bill, long and frightening, with numbers far beyond what an average worker could pay. She whispered, "It's for my son. He's sick. The medicine, the tests, everything costs so much. I've been trying to pay little by little, but it keeps getting worse." Her voice broke as she explained how she worked extra hours, skipped meals to save money, and borrowed from neighbors, yet the bill only grew. The hospital had warned her that if she didn't pay soon, they might stop treatment for her son. The CEO felt a heavy ache in his chest as he listened. This wasn't just about money. This was about a mother's desperate love for her child and the weight of helplessness she carried every day. Rosa tried to laugh lightly, saying, "It's nothing. I'll manage somehow. I always do." But her trembling hands betrayed her strength. She folded the paper again and stuffed it into her apron pocket, as if hiding it could make the problem disappear. The CEO sat quietly, pretending to be just another worker, but inside his mind, his thoughts raced. He had built this hotel chain believing it was a place of opportunity, yet here sat one of his employees drowning in debt from a simple human need: health care for her child. He thought of all the profits his company made each year, the luxury suites, the expensive events, and then looked at Rosa, who earned so little despite giving so much of herself. The contrast was painful. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of Rosa crying in the small staff lounge haunted him. He kept hearing her words, "I'll manage somehow," spoken with a mix of courage and quiet despair. He wondered how many other workers carried similar burdens. Were there more hospital bills hidden in aprons, more tears shed in silence after long shifts? The next day, he paid closer attention. He noticed how Rosa moved through her duties with speed but also with exhaustion in her steps. He noticed the extra shifts she volunteered for, the way she rubbed her temples when she thought no one was watching, and how she sometimes skipped her lunch break, saying she wasn't hungry. Others mentioned how she often left late, cleaning rooms even after her hours ended, just to earn a little more. One evening, while walking past the laundry room, he overheard two workers whispering. They spoke about how Rosa's son had been in and out of the hospital for months, and how she had even sold some of her personal belongings to cover costs. They admired her strength but admitted they worried she would break down from carrying too much. The CEO realized he was beginning to see his company from a completely new angle. For years, he had looked at graphs, reports, and financial growth. But now, disguised in this uniform, he was looking into the human side of his business, the side that numbers could never reveal. It was no longer just Rosa's problem. It was his responsibility too. After all, she was part of the foundation that kept his empire standing. Without workers like her, the hotel would not shine, the guests would not smile, and the company would not thrive. That week, he continued working beside her, sometimes helping carry towels or scrubbing mirrors. He never told her who he was. Instead, he listened, observed, and let her presence remind him of something he had almost forgotten, that behind every company are real lives, real struggles, and real dreams. One night, as the shift ended, Rosa sat again in the staff lounge, holding the bill. This time, she wasn't crying. She was staring at it with empty eyes, as if she had no tears left. The CEO, sitting across from her, asked softly, "What will you do?" She looked at him and whispered, "I don't know. Maybe I'll take another job. Maybe I'll just keep trying. My son needs me strong. That's all that matters." Her words struck him deeply. Here was a woman with so little, yet she carried herself with so much courage. She wasn't thinking of herself at all, only her child. He admired her strength even more. And in that quiet moment, he made a silent promise. He didn't know exactly how or when, but he would help her. Not just with the bill, but in a way that would bring change for many like her. What began as a hidden mission to learn about his staff had turned into something personal and powerful. The CEO, still undercover, had found a truth that could not be ignored. A maid crying over an unpaid hospital bill had shown him more about humanity, responsibility, and leadership than any boardroom meeting ever had. The days went by slowly, and the undercover CEO kept his eyes open wider than ever before. After seeing Rosa break down with that hospital bill, he could no longer just observe. Every detail around him seemed sharper, more meaningful. He noticed how the workers walked, how they talked in hushed voices, and how they tried to smile even when their eyes told another story. The hotel was filled with shining floors, golden chandeliers, and expensive fragrances that drifted through the lobby, but the people who kept it all running lived with struggles that moneyed guests could never imagine. Rosa was still at the heart of his thoughts. Every morning, she arrived early, pushing her cart with determination. She greeted everyone politely, and if anyone needed help, she was the first to step forward. But behind her polite smile, the CEO could still see a shadow of worry. Sometimes, he caught her staring at her phone, biting her lip, probably reading messages from the hospital. Sometimes, she sat quietly in the corner during breaks, not eating anything, only sipping water. He began talking more with the other staff members. As he worked beside them, they treated him like one of their own. They didn't know he was the boss in disguise, so they spoke freely. That's when he started hearing more stories. A kitchen helper admitted that he often sent most of his salary back home to his family and barely had enough left for himself. A young bellboy confessed he was trying to pay for his younger sister's school fees but kept falling short. One older worker quietly said that he had skipped going to the doctor for months because he didn't want to spend the money. Each story opened the CEO's eyes wider. These weren't lazy people or careless workers. These were men and women giving their best every day, Yet life outside the hotel walls was still a constant struggle. They carried heavy trays, scrubbed floors, carried luggage, smiled at strangers, and endured long hours, but when they returned home, their pockets were often empty and their worries remained. The CEO found himself thinking back to the polished reports his executives showed him during board meetings. Charts that highlighted record profits, presentations full of glowing words like growth and expansion. But none of those reports mentioned Rosa's unpaid hospital bill. None mentioned the bellboy sister who couldn't afford her books. None mentioned the pain in a worker's back from standing all day. He realized that numbers alone could never tell the full story of his company. One afternoon, as he was folding sheets with Rosa in one of the guest rooms, he decided to gently ask her about her life outside of work. She hesitated at first, then spoke slowly. She told him about her son, a bright boy who loved to draw and wanted to become an engineer one day. She spoke about how her husband had passed away years ago, leaving her to raise the child alone. She worked long hours to cover everything: rent, food, school, and now, the crushing medical bills. She admitted that sometimes she wished she could rest, but rest was a luxury she could not afford. Her words sank deep into him. He admired her strength, but he also felt an uncomfortable guilt. How many times had he stood at the top floor of his office, looking down at the busy workers, believing that paying their salaries was enough? How many times had he convinced himself that his responsibility ended at signing checks and approving budgets? Now, standing beside Rosa, watching her neatly fold sheets despite her tired hands, he realized leadership meant far more. Later that week, an incident brought his growing thoughts into sharper focus. Rosa had taken an extra evening shift. She moved quickly between rooms, trying to keep up with the workload. In the middle of her tasks, she suddenly leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The CEO, who had been nearby, rushed to her side and offered her a chair. She waved him off at first, saying she was fine, but her pale face told another story. She finally admitted that she hadn't eaten since morning because she was saving money for her son's medicine. He felt a mix of anger at the system and deep sadness for her. Rosa was sacrificing her own health for her child's, and no one seemed to notice except him. He gave her a bottle of water and gently encouraged her to rest for a few minutes. As she sat there quietly, he thought again of how many workers were silently suffering like her, hidden behind uniforms and polite smiles. The undercover CEO began paying attention to smaller details. He noticed how many staff members skipped breaks, how some stayed late even without being asked, how a few borrowed money from each other to get through the week. He realized that while the hotel shone brightly for its guests, the people who gave it that shine lived in constant shadows of financial stress. At night, when he returned to his private apartment away from the hotel, he could not shake these thoughts. He remembered Rosa's tired eyes, the whispered stories of his employees, and the quiet sacrifices made each day. His heart grew heavier with each passing moment. He wondered if his role as a leader meant simply running a profitable business, or if it meant carrying responsibility for the lives that kept that business alive. One evening, he walked into the staff lounge again and found Rosa sitting at a table with two other workers. They were speaking in low voices about hospital expenses, school fees, and unpaid rent. They laughed softly at their own worries, almost as if humor was the only shield they had against reality. He sat nearby, pretending to be busy, but their conversation cut through him like truth always does. It became clear to him that Rosa's story was not unique. It was a mirror of so many others. And suddenly, he understood something he had never truly grasped before. His company wasn't just a business, it was a community. And a community could not thrive if its people were quietly breaking inside. The more he listened, the more determined he became. He knew he couldn't reveal himself yet, not until he had thought carefully about the steps he would take. But deep in his heart, a decision was forming. He would not let Rosa, or any of the others, continue to suffer unseen. He would find a way to bring change. Not just with temporary help, but with something lasting, something that would give every worker a sense of dignity, security, and hope. As the days passed, Rosa continued to inspire him with her quiet courage. Despite everything, she never gave up. She still greeted every guest politely, still helped her coworkers, and still kept her head high. She had no idea that her silent struggle was opening the eyes of the very man who could change everything. The CEO, hidden in plain sight, realized that this was no longer just an undercover mission. This was a turning point in his life. He had come to see the reality of his workers, and what he found was not weakness but incredible strength. Strength that deserved to be honored, respected, and supported. He promised himself that soon, very soon, he would step out of the shadows, and when he did, nothing in his company would remain the same. The following week brought even more weight to the thoughts already pressing on the undercover CEO's heart. He had entered this experiment to learn what life was like for his employees, but now the faces and voices of those workers lived in his mind every hour of the day. Rosa's quiet strength was the center of it all. Every time he saw her push her cleaning cart with tired arms or smile politely at a guest while pain lingered in her eyes, he felt a deep ache inside him. It wasn't just Rosa anymore. By spending more time on the ground floor of his own company, he saw details he had never noticed before. He saw workers with shoes so worn out that holes peeked from the sides. He noticed hands cracked and rough from constant scrubbing and lifting. He heard the cough of a worker who never went to see a doctor, because he could not afford it. And he saw how many of them covered their struggles with humor or silence, never expecting help from anyone. The CEO began writing notes secretly at night. He listed the problems he had witnessed: long working hours, low pay that barely covered basic needs, and the complete absence of support for emergencies like medical bills. His pen stopped at Rosa's name. Her son's hospital bill had been the moment that broke open his vision, and now it stood as a symbol of everything wrong. One evening, as the day's shift ended, Rosa stayed behind in the lounge, folding her apron carefully. She looked exhausted, but there was something new in her eyes, fear mixed with determination. When the CEO sat near her and gently asked how her son was doing, her voice trembled. She said the hospital had warned her again. The bills were overdue, and without payment, they might stop treatment. She tried to speak calmly, but her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. The CEO wanted so badly to reveal who he was in that moment and promise her that everything would be fine. But he held back. He knew that if he acted too quickly, his help would look like a one-time gesture, a bandage on a deep wound. He wanted something bigger, something lasting. Still, it tore at him to sit in silence while she held back tears. The very next day, something happened that changed the pace of his mission. Rosa was working in one of the guest rooms when she suddenly collapsed onto the chair, holding her head. The CEO, who had been nearby, rushed in and helped her steady herself. She laughed softly, brushing it off as dizziness. But he knew the truth: this was exhaustion, pure and heavy. She confessed she had been working extra shifts back to back, and sometimes she hardly slept more than a few hours. He felt helpless but also more determined. That night, when he returned home, he could no longer rest peacefully. The picture of Rosa, pale and worn, replayed in his mind again and again. He thought of her son waiting for her at home, depending on her strength, not knowing how close she was to breaking. By the end of that week, the undercover CEO had reached a decision. He could not delay any longer. He had seen enough, felt enough, and understood enough. The workers were the foundation of the hotel, but they were carrying heavy weights in silence. If he continued to ignore this, he would fail as a leader, not because the company lacked profit, but because the people who created that profit were drowning in hardship. Still, he wanted to act carefully. He began small, asking workers casual questions about their needs. When he sat with the laundry staff during lunch, he asked what would make their jobs easier. Some mentioned better equipment, others said shorter shifts, but one older woman simply said, "Sometimes, just a little respect." Those words struck him deeply. They weren't asking for miracles. They were asking to be seen, heard, and valued. The turning point came late one evening when he entered the staff lounge again and found Rosa alone with another bill in her hand. This time, she wasn't crying. Instead, she looked almost numb, as though her emotions had been drained completely. The CEO sat beside her quietly, and she whispered, "I don't know what to do anymore. My son needs me, but I feel like I'm failing him." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she buried her face in her hands. He could not stay silent anymore. Though he still kept his identity hidden, he leaned closer and said gently, "You're not failing him. You are fighting for him every single day. You're stronger than you know. And maybe help will come from where you least expect it." Rosa gave him a tired smile, as if she didn't believe his words, but thanked him for saying them. That night, the CEO made his final choice. The undercover journey was almost over. He had seen enough pain to last him a lifetime, and it was time to turn it into action. But before he revealed who he was, he wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, it would not be a simple announcement, it would be the beginning of real change. He contacted his trusted team secretly and began drafting new policies. He planned to create a fund that would help employees in times of emergency, especially medical needs. He wanted fairer wages, shorter shifts, and proper health benefits. He wanted to transform the culture of the company from the inside out. But all of this would be announced only after he revealed his true self to the workers. Meanwhile, Rosa continued working as though nothing could break her spirit. She smiled at guests, polished furniture, and folded sheets with the same neatness every day. But the undercover CEO knew the storm she carried inside her. He knew that every polite smile was a mask covering fear, and every tired movement was a sign of the battles she was fighting silently. In the days that followed, his determination only grew stronger. Every worker's face told a story. Every whispered conversation added fuel to his mission. He no longer saw them as employees. He saw them as family, people whose lives deserved care, respect, and dignity. The undercover role had given him the greatest gift, truth. And with that truth, he was ready to step out of the shadows. Soon, very soon, the workers would know who he really was. And when that moment came, he would make sure Rosa's tears, and the struggles of every other employee, would not be forgotten. This was no longer just an undercover project. This was the beginning of a transformation that would touch every life in his company. The day finally arrived when the undercover CEO could no longer remain hidden. For weeks, he had worked side by side with his employees, listened to their stories, and carried their pain in his own heart. He had seen Rosa's tears, her strength, and her exhaustion. He had listened to workers whisper about unpaid rent, sick family members, and endless double shifts. He had felt the weight of the truth. His company looked perfect from the outside, but inside, the people who gave it life were struggling every day. He spent the night before the big reveal thinking about what he would say. In his apartment, the lights of the city glowed outside the window, but his thoughts were only on Rosa and the others. He had written notes, crossed them out, and rewritten them again. He didn't want to sound like a boss giving orders. He wanted to speak like a human who had learned from other humans. He wanted them to feel seen, respected, and valued. The next morning, the hotel buzzed with activity. Guests checked out, new ones checked in, and the staff moved quickly as usual. But by mid-afternoon, word spread that all employees were to gather in the main conference hall. The staff whispered among themselves. It was rare to have a company-wide meeting like this, and curiosity filled the air. Rosa herself wondered what it could be about, though her thoughts were still heavy with worry for her son's treatment. When everyone had gathered, the undercover CEO stepped onto the stage. He wore no disguise now. No uniform, no fake name. He stood tall, wearing a suit, but his expression carried humility rather than authority. The workers looked up in surprise. Some gasped softly, recognizing him from company photos, though they had never seen him in person before. Rosa's eyes widened in shock as she realized that the quiet man who had folded sheets beside her was, in fact, the head of the entire company. The CEO took a deep breath before speaking. His voice was calm but full of emotion. He began by telling them the truth. For weeks, he had lived among them, working as one of them, listening and learning. At first, there was silence in the room. Then murmurs spread quickly as workers exchanged surprised glances. Rosa covered her mouth with her hand, unable to believe what she was hearing. He explained why he had done it. He told them that numbers and reports had never shown him the reality of their lives, so he chose to see it for himself. He admitted that he had been blind to many of their struggles and that the company had failed to care for the very people who made it successful. His words were not polished like a business speech. They were raw, simple, and honest. Then, he spoke about Rosa. He did not use her name to protect her dignity, but he shared the story of a hard-working maid who was carrying the heavy burden of her son's hospital bills. He said her quiet tears had opened his eyes, and her strength had reminded him what true courage looked like. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest as she realized he was speaking about her. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time, they were not tears of despair. They were tears of being seen. The CEO then paused, looked at every face in the room, and made an announcement that changed everything. He declared that from that day forward, the company would launch a support fund for employees facing emergencies, especially medical needs. No worker would ever again have to choose between health and survival. He promised better wages, fairer working hours, and access to proper health care benefits. He announced scholarships for employees' children, so that dreams like Rosa's son becoming an engineer could become real. The room erupted with a mixture of gasps, whispers, and applause. Many workers wiped tears from their eyes. Some smiled widely, hugging the person next to them. For the first time, they felt their struggles were not invisible. The CEO was not just making promises, he was giving them dignity. Finally, he turned back to Rosa. This time, he addressed her directly. "There is a mother among us," he said, "who has carried more weight than anyone should ever have to. Today, her son's hospital bill will be paid in full. And tomorrow, and the next day, she will know that she is not alone anymore. Because none of you are alone. We are a family, and families take care of each other." The applause grew louder, filling the hall with energy. Rosa's hands shook as she tried to cover her tears, but this time, they were tears of relief and gratitude. She felt the crushing weight on her shoulders finally lift. Her son would get the treatment he needed. Her endless nights of fear were over. And more than that, every worker in that room knew their lives were about to change. The CEO stepped down from the stage and walked among the employees, shaking their hands, listening to their words, and thanking them for their hard work. They no longer saw him as a distant figure sitting in a glass office. They saw him as a leader who had walked beside them, seen their struggles, and chosen compassion. That evening, Rosa returned home and hugged her son tightly. She told him through tears and laughter that his hospital bills had been paid, and he could keep dreaming about becoming an engineer. The boy, innocent and bright, hugged her back and said, "See, Mama. I told you things would get better." The CEO's decision spread quickly, not just inside the company but also outside. People began to talk about the leader who had gone undercover, discovered the truth about his workers, and changed everything. It wasn't just a story about business anymore, it was a story about humanity, about what could happen when leaders listened with their hearts instead of just their eyes. That night, the CEO sat in his office for the first time after weeks of working undercover. The desk felt different now, the walls seemed less distant. He no longer saw his company as a machine of profit but as a living community filled with people like Rosa. And he knew this was just the beginning. The changes he had promised were not enough unless he continued to listen, to care, and to act. He silently vowed never to lose sight of the human side of leadership again. The days that followed the big announcement felt different inside the hotel. The air seemed lighter, and smiles appeared more often on the faces of workers who once carried quiet sadness. There was a sense of hope, almost like the sun had broken through a long stretch of clouds. For the first time in years, the employees felt like their voices had been heard. They were no longer invisible. Their stories mattered. Rosa, especially, walked with a new strength in her steps. Her son's hospital bill had been paid, and she no longer woke up in fear of losing him. Each morning, when she looked at her boy before heading to work, she saw brightness in his eyes again. He was healing, and his laughter filled their small home. That laughter gave Rosa energy she had not felt in a long time. She still worked hard, but the heavy burden that once weighed on her heart was gone. The CEO, now no longer undercover, visited the hotel often. But this time, he wasn't there just to inspect profits or count bookings. He was there to walk among the staff, shake their hands, and listen. He remembered the promise he had made to himself that leadership was not about sitting in an office, far away from the people, but about standing with them, side by side. Every conversation, every smile, and every story he heard added fuel to his mission of keeping the company human at its core. Changes began rolling out quickly. A new fund was created to help employees in times of emergencies. It wasn't just medical bills anymore. If someone's child needed school supplies, if a family faced sudden hardship, if a worker needed help during a crisis, the fund was there. Health benefits were expanded, and wages were adjusted to reflect not just hard work but dignity. Employees who once felt stuck now believed in a future where their efforts were valued. But the most powerful change was not in money alone. It was in the spirit of the people. Workers began to talk openly about their needs, no longer hiding their struggles. They looked at each other differently, not just as co-workers but as a family. Rosa found herself encouraging others, reminding them that no one was alone anymore. She often thought back to the night she cried over her son's bill in the staff lounge. If she had known then what would come, she would never have believed it. Her bond with the CEO grew quietly but strongly. Though she still called him sir with respect, he always reminded her to speak freely. One afternoon, he asked her, "Do you know what gave me the courage to make these changes?" Rosa shook her head, unsure. He smiled gently and said, "It was you. You showed me the truth that I had been blind to. Your strength taught me what leadership really means." Rosa's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. She had never imagined her struggles could inspire change on such a scale. The story of the undercover CEO spread far beyond the walls of the hotel. Newspapers wrote about it. Guests who once only noticed the chandeliers and fine food now looked at the staff with more respect, knowing the company's leader had chosen compassion over profit. Other business owners began to ask themselves hard questions. If he could do it, why couldn't they? Could they, too, look beyond charts and numbers to see the human side of their businesses? Slowly, his actions started to inspire others in ways he had not expected. Rosa's son recovered well, and true to his dream, he continued drawing and studying with passion. With the help of the new scholarship program, he was able to pursue his education without the constant worry of money. Rosa often sat beside him in the evenings, watching him sketch bridges and machines with excitement. She would smile, knowing his future was brighter than her past. The CEO's relationship with his workers deepened as months passed. He wasn't a distant figure anymore. He often visited the kitchen, the laundry room, or the lounge just to share a cup of tea or listen to stories. The employees felt comfortable approaching him, not with fear, but with trust. They knew he cared. That trust transformed the entire company culture. People began working not just for a paycheck, but with pride, knowing their leader valued their lives. For Rosa, life became something she had almost forgotten: peaceful. She no longer worked endless double shifts. She no longer skipped meals. She no longer cried quietly over bills she could not pay. She carried herself with dignity, knowing she was part of a company that cared for her as much as she cared for it. Sometimes, when she walked through the hotel halls, she thought about the first time the undercover CEO found her crying in the staff lounge. That night had felt like the end of hope, but in truth, it was the beginning of everything. The CEO himself often reflected on the journey. He realized that his greatest achievement was not building a profitable empire but building a company that put people first. He knew there would still be challenges, but he was no longer afraid of them. With compassion and truth as his guide, he believed he could face anything. Rosa's story had changed him forever, and he carried that lesson into every decision he made. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall glass windows of his office, he thought of the word legacy. He understood now that true legacy was not in the size of a business or the wealth of a leader. True legacy lived in the lives touched, the burdens lifted, and the hope restored. And for him, that legacy had started with a maid's quiet tears. Years later, people in the company still told the story of the day everything changed. They spoke of the undercover CEO who had walked among them, seen their struggles, and chosen to act. They spoke of Rosa, whose courage opened the door to a new chapter for everyone. They told the story not just as company history, but as a reminder that compassion has the power to transform lives. And whenever Rosa's son looked at the bridges he had drawn or the machines he dreamed of building, he always remembered his mother's strength and the leader who chose kindness. For him, and for many others, it was proof that sometimes one moment, one choice, and one act of compassion could truly change everything.